Welcome to Lesson 6.1, Testing and Examination, that's T&E, Overview. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security Assessment and Testing domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge A, which is to design and validate assessment and test strategies. And our topics for this lesson are going to include examination and testing objectives and methods, perspective, knowledge, regulatory requirements, and NIST resources. An information security assessment is a process of determining how effectively the entity that's being evaluated, or the target, meets specific security criteria. Now we're referring to that also as assurance because remember, assurance is the confidence that our controls work as expected. So an information security assessment is one of the tools that we use for assurance. Now the object of an assessment is to substantiate strengths and to identify weaknesses and failures. The target of the assessment is known as the assessment object. The security assessment process is often referred to as T&E, and that stands for testing and examination. So what we're going to do next is look at those two components, testing and examination. Examinations are used to determine if the assessment object, or our target, is properly documented and to gain operational insight. By nature, examinations are passive, and they primarily involve the review of policies, standards, baselines, procedures, plans, or programs. Our assessment targets, or our objects, may include information security policies. They might include technical components such as configuration settings or rule sets or logs, reports, or diagrams. They may include our incident response plans, our business continuity plans, our disaster recovery plans, our vendor management plans, our security plans. We're again examining them to ensure they're properly documented and to gain operational insight to ensure that they're complete and they're accurate. Examinations typically have no operational impact because we're not taking actions, we're just examining documents or we're conducting interviews. Testing is used to identify vulnerabilities and to predict the likelihood of exploitation. So testing is active and specifically targets the assessment object. So our testing techniques may include vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, password cracking, social engineering, as well as incident response and disaster recovery and business continuity exercises. In subsequent lessons, we're going to be looking very specifically at examination techniques, and we're going to be looking at each one of these testing techniques, including vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, password cracking, and social engineering. Testing can be intrusive. And because it's intrusive, it can potentially have an operational impact, and that is to be taken into consideration when planning your testing. So just let's take a look at some strengths and weaknesses of both. A strength of an examination is that we may gain insight not otherwise available, and we have a broad scope of coverage with very limited resources. So we can look at a lot of information without having folks that have particularly specialized knowledge other than perhaps operational knowledge or audit knowledge. And because we have access to so many documents, we really can gain some very good insight and understand the nuances of our documentation, of our programs, our procedures, whatever the target of our examination is. The weakness is that it doesn't necessarily provide assurance that the security controls are working as intended. We know that the controls are there, we know that they're documented. How well they're actually working, we can't tell during the examination. A testing strength is it can provide real-world picture of the organization's security posture. Your testing types can evolve over time and they can mimic current attacker techniques. So when we test, we really truly get a sense of how the control is responding and what our strengths and weaknesses are. The downside of testing is it may not provide a comprehensive evaluation due to limitations of time. So most tests only happen for a certain period of time, whether they're conducted by internal personnel or independent personnel, which means that their scope is going to be fairly limited. And they can be intrusive, so they can cause problems that may interrupt production or just intrusive in some other manner. So let's take a firewall, for example, and look at the difference between a firewall examination and firewall testing. So let's say we did a firewall examination of a rule set. Well, some of our findings may be that rules were written incorrectly. Perhaps the syntax is wrong, that rules are in the wrong order, that we have some outdated or unnecessary rules, that we have incorrect group memberships, meaning groups of computers or groups of objects, and that maybe we can see that the passwords are contained in the configuration file in clear text. So these could be some of the findings that we would have in an examination if we were looking at both the configuration settings of the firewall and of the specific rules themselves. But if we did some testing, let's say we did an external vulnerability assessment and penetration test, so we're coming in from the outside without knowledge of the rule set, without knowledge of the configuration, just to see how the firewall is responding. How does it present itself, or how does it look to the outsider? We might be able to identify and potentially exploit vulnerabilities, and we would be able to test the resistance to disruption attacks such as distributed denial of service, or DDoS. So you can see here the difference between examination and testing, but what's important to remember is these are very complementary. And for a number of our controls, we're going to want to be doing both examination and testing. Our testing viewpoint refers to perspective, the knowledge of target, and interaction. Now, perspective can be internal, internal limited, or external, and we'll go deeper in those in just a sec. Knowledge and interaction can be overt, or it can be covert. So our knowledge and interaction can be overt or covert. Overt security testing, which is also known as white hat testing, involves performing external or internal testing with the knowledge and the consent of the organization's IT staff, so they know what's happening. Covert security testing, which is also known as black hat testing, takes an adversarial approach by performing testing without the knowledge of the organization's IT staff, but with the full knowledge and permission of upper management. So upper management has said go for it, but we haven't told the IT team that's doing that. And the reason we're emphasizing IT team is that testing is almost always going to be against some type of technical control. Now, it could be against a physical control as well, in which case just substitute the organization's IT staff with the organization's physical security staff. It's really the same meaning for both overt and covert, regardless of what department we're talking about. So jumping back to perspective. Perspective internal, internal limited, or external. Internal means that I'm on the inside, right, and I'm really being given full information. So in an examination, I'll have all the document I requested being provided, and I really get a privileged insider look, because my perspective is I'm an insider, I'm internal to the organization. In a testing internal perspective, I will probably get a privileged view, an authenticated account, and I'll have few, if any, physical or technical restrictions. I'm conducting the test as if I am internal and knowledgeable. In a limited internal, in an examination, I might be provided a subset of documentation, and in limited internal testing, I may have to do the testing as if I was a general user or a visitor with whatever the access restrictions might be based on being just a general user or visitor. External, meaning I'm doing this to an outside party. If I'm doing an external examination, so I'm doing due diligence, let's say on a vendor, I'm probably going to get vetted reports. That's what's going to be provided to me. They're probably sanitized or scaled down. They're well vetted. From testing, I might get a very limited view conducted from outside of the organization's security perimeter. So again, my perspective, internal, internal limited, and external. And then our knowledge and approach, right, overt, was that who knows about it? Well, management will know about it, information technology personnel will know about it, security personnel will know about it. If there are third-party personnel who are involved, they'll know about it. And the approach is very cooperative. Right? So overt, full knowledge, cooperative. Covert, right, only a limited subset of executive management is going to know, and it's adversarial. It doesn't mean we're angry at each other. It just means that we're not cooperative. There will be times when an organization will do testing because they have a regulatory requirement or a contractual obligation. So there are a number of regulations and contractual obligations that either expect or mandate that organizations conduct security assessments on a scheduled basis. So, for example, the FFIEC, which is the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, expects financial institutions to undergo periodic audits and independent testing. The Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, mandates testing for federal agencies. PCI DSS version 3.0, that's the payment card industry data security standard, requires annual internal and external assessments for the cardholder environment. In subsequent lessons, we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of these so you can see both who the examiners would be and what the expectations are. Now, there is a very good NIST resource specific to security testing. It's SP 800, SP with special publication, 800-115, which is a technical guide to information security testing and assessment. I would strongly encourage that you download that, that you read it, study it for both the exam and for your own knowledge. So that's going to take us to our lesson review. So we're in lesson 6.1 review. We started with talking about testing and examination objectives and that they are different. Right? Examination is passive, testing is active. We looked at perspective. So we looked at the internal and external, or actually internal, limited internal and external. We looked at knowledge, which is covert and overt. And we did a cursory review of the fact that we may need to do testing because there are regulatory requirements. And lastly, I shared with you a NIST resource that I would strongly encourage you to go out, download, and read. So that brings us to our lesson 6.1, match the meaning. Some of these terms you've had before. Some are new to this lesson, but our terms are assurance, assessment object, examination, testing, intrusive, overt, covert, and interview. So take a few minutes, put me on pause, match the meaning. When you're ready, come on back and we'll go through them together. And let's try our lesson 6.1 terms. Assurance is knowledge that controls work as intended. Our assessment object is the target of the examination or testing. Sometimes that will also be referred to as our assessment target. So assessment object, assessment target, they're really interchangeable terms. An examination is passive. It can be a passive review, could be observation or analysis. Testing is going to be an active exercise. Remember that testing can sometimes be intrusive. Intrusive means to have an operational impact. Overt means white hat testing. It's done with full disclosure, knowledge of everybody involved, and it is collaborative and cooperative. Covert, sometimes called black hat testing, is with limited management knowledge. The group that's being tested will not know that they're being tested, and it's considered adversarial. And lastly, an interview is just a way to facilitate flow of information. So that brings us to our CISSP exam tips. Remembering that the objective of an assessment is to substantiate strengths and identify weaknesses and failures. The testing may be intrusive and can have an operational impact, so we'll need to consider that in our planning. And T&E should always be authorized. That we always want to ensure that any testing and examination we do is authorized by management. So thank you very much for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.